Hello my dear sewing friends, it's Alisa here and welcome to Sew and Grow, a channel that is dedicated to sewing and creating beautiful clothes for kids. And today I actually wanted to talk to you about a really fun and also really important topic when it comes to kids' clothes, and that of course is upcycling. Now personally, I know all too well how fast kids can grow, especially during those crazy growth spurts. So upcycling really does two things for me. Number one, it does provide a creative outlet. And bonus points if you do that together with your kids. That way, perhaps they can learn a technical skill, they can really engage their creativity and imagination. Plus, when they get to wear what they have made either by themselves or with you together, it does provide a sense of accomplishment. And number two, of course, a really important part, it does help stretch the lifespan of the clothes, whether they were handmade or store-bought, and it saves you money in the process. Now, all of my upcycling I like to divide in two categories. One category is a creative upcycling, where you take a garment, you completely reimagine it, you can deconstruct it, you can reinvent the wheel, you can apply new techniques, bells and whistles, this and that. The other category is basic upcycling, where the techniques are very simple yet very effective and deliver a good result. So that's the category that we're going to be focusing on today. Here I have 3 garments that my daughter has outgrown, but they're all in great condition, so it would be such a shame to let them go. So instead, we're going to transform them. So let's get started with this one. These are ready-to-wear jeans and she loves them, but my daughter is quite a tall girl. Now these jeans are about this short, so we're going to reduce the length and remake them into shorts. I call this first technique reducing length, and I use it very often, and it works great on any bottom. So as you can see here, jeans, pants, culottes, even skirts. But it can also work really well on the top garments as well. For example, let's say you have a tunic top with long sleeves, and it still fits really well on the body lengthwise, but in the sleeve is just a tad too short, therefore it looks a little bit awkward. You can reduce the length of the sleeve to be 3/4, and therefore wear your tunic top again. To begin, we have to determine how much length you want to reduce, or in other words, where the new hem of the garment is going to be. For that, you can place the garment on the body and then use one of the marking tools like a piece of chalk or maybe heat erasable pen and mark the positioning of the new hem. Another option would be to take another well-fitting garment where you know the length of the hem is perfect and place it on top, aligning it at the crotch, and then using that as a guide for the new hem. When I'm marking the new length, I usually keep 2 things in mind. Number 1, it has to be perpendicular to the side seam, and number 2, both legs have to match. Before I move on to the next point, I want to make sure that my hem here aligns on the bottom, unless there are some pants that feature a high-low hem, but in this case it's just a straight hem, so I just want to make sure that it aligns like this. And now we're going to grab our scissors and we're going to cut. But instead of cutting on the line that we have marked, we're actually going to be cutting 1 inch below that. So if you'd like, you can grab a ruler and you can draw another line 1 inch below the original line, and that is what we're going to cut because we need that hem allowance in order to be able to fold it under and then hem our new shorts. Now, the width of the hem allowance will always greatly depend on what kind of hem you're going to do, but I find that 1 inch of the hem allowance is easy to manage, plus it's a great width for a double fold hem, which completely encloses the raw edge of the fabric and is super easy to do. If you're working with slippery fabrics, it does help if you pin the fabric above and below where you need to cut, so that way it doesn't move. Now it's time to fold that hem. Let's go ahead and grab our project. And if you do have an ironing board and an iron, this is a great time to take them out and use them as well. Now we're going to fold our hem 1/2 inch in first, and then you can either pin it or you can take your iron and you can press it. Now, heat overall is a great helper in sewing and tailoring and upcycling, so if you have a chance to get an iron, definitely do it. Now, I am eyeballing this 1/2 inch, but you can of course use a ruler or a measuring tape and make sure that it is 1/2 inch indeed. And we're going to do it all the way around. Now this area right over here is going to be way too thick if I'm going to fold it over one more time. I'm probably going to break my needle trying to go through that. So I'm going to reduce the bulk a little bit. You see the crease of the fold? I'm going to snip in here and snip in here, and I'm going to cut this little piece out, like so. Following exactly the same steps, we're going to fold it in one more time and press it. However, I'm not going to cut out this piece anymore. Now, before moving on to the last and final step, I do one extra thing, and that is actually basting the hem with hand-sewn needle and thread. I find that it holds the thick fabric a lot better than just having a dozen of little pins inside, and I'm not risking being pricked while sewing this little narrow hem. At the sewing machine, I'm just using a regular size needle that's already in, but if you are working on jeans, then it's always nice to have a denim needle or needle that's a little bit larger. I'm also going to be using just a regular straight stitch. Each of the seams we're going to start with the back stitching and end with the back stitching as well. Since the total width of my hem on the inside is 1/2 inch, my goal is to stitch less than 1/2 inch away from the edge of the shorts, so that way I catch the edge of the hem from the inside. Now, most of the sewing machines do have some sort of hem guide on the right side of the presser foot, but let's say you do not, or you're just finding it really hard to follow, then you can use a piece of washi tape or a painter's tape, or perhaps something like a post-it note, and place that and use that as a guide as you sew. Try not to rush this part so that way you don't have to unpick uneven stitches or seams later. Also, when going over really thick seams like in this example, I do hand crank my sewing machine for a couple of stitches so that way I am totally in control and I can avoid any problems. Once I'm done, this is what we're going to have. Now, 1 row of stitches is totally sufficient, but in my case, I just decided to go for 2 rows of stitches, one on the top, one on the bottom of the hem. Now, on the inside, you can see the hem and everything is nice and tucked away. But let's talk about this little moment over here where we did snip out that bulk of the seam. Since I've been doing upcycling, I've done this particular procedure a handful of times, and none of the times anything came apart. But if you are concerned about unraveling fabric, or you just want to make sure, you can take a little bottle of fray check and drop a couple of drops on this area. Now, if you don't have a fray check or you don't want to get one, you can simply use hand sewing needle and thread, and you can overcast this little part so that way you know it's nice and secure. As a final touch, my daughter wanted to add a couple of iron-on patches, so that's exactly what we did. Now let's take a look at before and after. Now let's move on to the second one, and the technique here is actually quite opposite, and that is adding length. Now, this is a little jacket that I made for my daughter, I believe sometime last year, and it is actually made entirely from fabric scraps. And if you would like to see that process, I will leave the link for the video in the description. Now, same like with the jeans that we just worked on, width-wise it still fits really well, length-wise it still fits really well as well. But the problem is in the length of the sleeves. The sleeve definitely needs to be about 1.5 inches longer, and then we also have a little bit of wear and tear here, which I need to repair. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a seam ripper and unpick this entire seam that connects the cuff to the sleeve. While I'm getting this done, I would like to explain why in this video I haven't included any width alterations and why I barely ever do them. And I have 2 reasons for it. Number 1, based on my personal experience, I find that kids grow much faster in length than they do in width. And usually kids' clothing is made with some sort of elastic or stretch at the waist. Therefore, the width of the waist lasts much longer than the actual length of the garment. And usually I find that if I do need to adjust the width of the garment, then it's very possible that I also need to do something about the length of the garment as well. And those 2 combined means that I'm basically reworking the entire piece of clothing. Now that my cuff is detached, I'm going to draft a new one, and lucky for me, I do have a couple of scraps of blue French terry. It also stretches just like the original cuff right over here. So when you're going to be doing something very similar, you need to pick the fabric with the same properties as the one that you're going to be replacing. When I'm going to be cutting my new cuff, I will be cutting it exactly the same width, but I'm going to be adding 1.5 inches on the top and 1.5 inches on the bottom, since that is the length that I'm missing. So this was the old cuff and this is the new cuff. First, I'm going to stitch this long side, and if you are working with knit fabrics, make sure that you're using a knit stitch, like for example, zigzag stitch, lightning stitch, or 3-step zigzag. If you do have your serger, you can of course use your serger for it as well. Now, seam allowances on knits are usually pretty small, in my case about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. When you're sewing the cuffs, don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and at the end of each seam. Once done, this is what you're going to have, and as you can see, the seam is still stretchy. Now what we want to do is grab it, align at the seams first, and then just fold it wrong sides together, so that way it forms a little tube, aka a cuff. Usually the cuff is a tad smaller than the sleeve in knit garments. Therefore, I like to fold my sleeve in half with the seam on one side, and then I do a little mark on the other side. On the sleeve over here, the color is dark, so you won't be able to see any markings. So you can fold it in half with the seam on one side, and then do a tiny little notch on the other side, so that way you know that that's the halfway point of your cuff. Now I'm going to take my cuff and the sleeve, and I'm going to place the sleeve inside of the cuff. And the first thing that I'm going to do is align the seam on the sleeve and the seam on the cuff, place it right sides together and pin it. Then I'm going to do exactly the same on the opposite side at the halfway point of the sleeve and that little notch that we made on the cuff. Usually for me this is enough because you will need to stretch the cuff a little bit as you sew it in. However, if you do feel that you would need more pins just to make sure that it goes a little smoother, you can of course add more, or you can even take it a step further and baste it in. Also use a stretch stitch when attaching the cuff to the sleeve, and since most knit fabrics don't fray, there's no need to finish the raw edges. If you're doing upcycles but you don't have a sewing machine, please don't be discouraged. A lot of these things can be done by hand as well, and I know that sometimes people discount hand sewing, but it's very effective, it's very strong, and if you do it super neat, you can't even tell the difference unless you look inside of the garment. After that, all you have to do is repeat it on both sides, and that's it, it's done. So far we've discussed two techniques, adding length and reducing length. This third technique is all about minor transformations that sort of result in a completely new garment. This is a little store-bought t-shirt that my daughter hasn't necessarily grown out of just yet, but it is an extra t-shirt, therefore it doesn't really get much wear at all. So instead, we're going to turn it into a really cute dress. Now, I just so happen to have this beautiful Minnie Mouse knit that was a gift from my friend that is the perfect shade and color to match with this t-shirt. First, I'm going to mark my child's natural waist on the t-shirt, and then, like in the first example in this video, we're going to cut a little bit below that, in this case about ½ an inch lower. The skirt part is going to be a circle skirt, and I do have a full step-by-step tutorial on drafting and sewing a circle skirt, so we're not going to go into the nitty-gritty right now. But the key point to know is that the center of the circle skirt, the circumference of it, is going to equal the circumference of the bottom of the t-shirt. Now, my circle skirt here does have 2 side seams, but that is purely because of how the fabric was arranged. I was actually working with 2 separate cuts of fabric, but your circle skirt, if that is a full circle, will not have any seams at all. To attach the skirt to the t-shirt, we're going to be using the same system as we did for attaching the cuffs in the previous example. We're going to make a couple of little markings. In my case, I'm going to align side seam with a side seam on both sides, and then I'm also going to mark the middle of the t-shirt and the center of the skirt and the center back of the skirt as well. That way I can align these little markings as I stitch it together. The fabric on the t-shirt is knit, and so is the fabric of the skirt. So in order to retain that stretch property, I'm going to connect the skirt to the t-shirt using a zigzag stitch. But I also know how kids are, and I know that they are very playful, but they also like to pull on things, like for example pulling on a skirt. So instead of doing just 1 row of zigzag stitches, I'm going to do 2 rows, one right next to each other. Most of the knits don't fray, and if you're using a knit that doesn't curl, you can actually leave the raw edges as is. But if you'd like to finish the edges of your skirt, I will leave a couple of really great options in the description of this video, so that way you can check them out. In my case, I did add just a tiny little trim on the bottom of the skirt, and that's it. Let's take a look at the final result. Well, my dear sewing friends, I truly hope that this video was helpful and informative. And if you're craving more upcycles, then definitely click on the video right over here. And I'll see you very soon on the channel again. Until next time, happy, thoughtful sewing. Bye!